India's bid for a permanent UNSC seat is getting more endorsements. Besides Russia, world leaders including UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Portugal's Prime Minister Luis Montenegro, they joined the French President Emmanuel Macron's bid for India's permanent candidature in the UNSC, in line with the External Affairs Minister Jaishankar's standpoint at the United Nations on UN reforms. Now, it may be recalled that only 5 countries, that's the United States, China, Russia and France, and the UK have permanent seats at the UNSC. Let's look at this report.
The need for reform of the United Nations, especially United Nations Security Council, has long been felt as to effectively address its functioning in the contemporary world order. In fact, during the recently held Summit of the Future at the United Nations in New York, India's Prime Minister called for urgent reform of the institutions of global governance, including the UN Security Council.
Success of humanity lies in our collective strength, not in the battlefield. और वैश्विक शांति एवं विकास के लिए ग्लोबल संस्थाओं में रिफॉर्म्स आवश्यक है. Reform is the key to relevance.
India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar also echoed the same sentiment of reforming the United Nations and giving representation to Asia, Africa and Latin America, as well as Global South in the UNSC.
Expansion and proper representation in the permanent category is a particular imperative. Asia, Africa and Latin America, the Global South, cannot continue to be shortchanged. They must be given their legitimate voice. Real change needs to happen and happen fast.
India's bid for permanent seat at the UNSC has been supported by France at the UNGA session.
France, as I reiterate here, is in favour of the Security Council being expanded. Germany, Japan, India, Brazil should be permanent members.
The current structure of the United Nations Security Council is confined to just 5 permanent members which have veto powers. These are United States, China, France, Russia and the United Kingdom. Presently, India has the support for its bid to be permanently represented in UNSC from the following countries. So by and large, India's stature in the world has been recognized by all the important organizations, and its bid for permanent membership of United Nations Security Council has been backed by a majority of countries, and it is only a matter of time when India's quest for an equitable, just rules-based international order with a voice of Global South, Africa, Asia and Latin America will be heard in the highest echelons of the world body. Bureau Report, DD India.
And for a deeper analysis on the UNSC and the need for reform, we have with us seasoned diplomat, Ambassador Prabhu Dayal, former senior diplomat. Ambassador Dayal, what success has the UNSC had in preventing war? There are 2 currently in the world, and the UNSC seems to be powerless.
Well, Mark, first of all, thanks for having me on your show. I may mention that the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, himself recently said that the UN is outdated, particularly the UNSC, and he warned that it will lose credibility because it is not being able to tackle global crisis and security-related situations. He made a very telling remark when he said that we can't build a future for our grandchildren with a system built for our grandparents. So there is a need for reforming the UN Security Council and making it more capable of addressing the problems on account of the escalating global conflicts and security challenges effectively. Now, I was listening to your news broadcast, and you very rightly pointed out that India has long sought a seat, a permanent seat on the UN Security Council to better represent the interests of developing nations and the geopolitical realities of the current world order. Now, the UNSC was set up 8 decades ago,
Yes.
when many countries, including India, were colonies. So it doesn't reflect present day realities. And I'm happy that India's candidature for a permanent membership of the UN Security Council is getting a support from a wide range of countries, including 4 of the permanent members.
Okay.
Recently, as you said, the UK Prime Minister, while speaking at the UN, supported India's case, as also the French President. Recently, President Biden lent his support. Russia has repeatedly supported India's case. The problem only remains China.
Indeed,
Because in terms-
Ambassador Dayal, you know, you did mention the UK, France, Russia, and the US reaffirming their support for India's permanent bid. But you know, how much weight does this have if each of these powers have veto powers and China has the veto power?
You know, Article 108 of the UN Charter outlines the process for amending the Charter itself. And it says that, of course, the General Assembly must approve the reforms by a 2/3 majority. The amended Charter then must be having the support of all the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. And China is a permanent member. China has a veto power, and China has repeatedly spoken against the need for UNSC reform. It wants to keep others out. In particular, you know, India's case is not at all acceptable to China. China sees us as its enemy. China wants to maintain global dominance. And in Asia, it wants to be the only power that matters. And if India gets a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, China feels that it is its case will be
diluted
will
a
come
bit.
down. It'll be weakened. So it plays a very negative role, and this is possible because of the UN Charter itself.
Okay, Ambassador Dayal, also, there are other ambitions. Let me quote William Ruto, the Kenyan president, and he says, and I quote, you know, an institution that excludes 54 African countries with 1.4 billion people while allowing one nation to veto decisions of the remaining 193 member states in the 21st century is simply unacceptable. And I'll also, give you the view of Alexander Vucic, who is the president of Serbia. He talks about another dilemma. He says that we are neither servants of Russia or the United States of America. We have our own politics and our own interests. What do you have to say?
Well, there are many forces which are trying to see that the UN Security Council is reformed in the manner in which they want it to be. There are interests involved. The G4 has been a very powerful factor in this regard, and it comprises Germany, Japan, India, and Brazil, which are countries which have support of a wide range of countries. Now, the UN reform of the Charter to admit new members to the Security Council has to have the support of the P5, each one of the P5. Now, if India is getting the support of 4 of the P5 members, then certainly it needs to be seen by a whole host of other countries, including African countries, that India has support, and India has repeatedly proven its credentials that it will help the countries of the global south. So if African countries want a better United Nations, if countries like Serbia want a better United Nations, then they have to realize that India's presence as a permanent member of the UN Security Council will be to their benefit. It'll be to their advantage. So that is why more and more countries are coming forward and supporting India's case.
Also, let's look at South America as a continent. Brazil is hoping to be a permanent member. But you know, the Argentinian president had this to say, and I quote, we have reached a situation where the Security Council, which is the most important body, has become distorted because the veto of its permanent members used for particular interests of some. an organization that's powerless to provide solutions to real global conflicts. And he goes on to mention the conflicts. But you know, the issue is about the veto power. Should the permanent members actually have this veto power at all?
Well, the veto power has been misused by several of the P5 members on a number of occasions. But the problem is that it's impossible to take it away from them. Because, as I said, the UN Charter can only be done with their support, and none of the P5 members will be in favor of the veto power being snatched away from them. So they will veto any suggestion to take away the veto power. That's the problem. This is the way the UN Security Council was set up. And although it's a faulty structure, but the problem is how to reform and amend this faulty structure.
All right. We'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Ambassador Prabhu Dayal, for throwing light on the situation. And of course, reforms is a slow process, but we are chipping away at it. Now, still to come.